Is this a negotiating tactic? Is it posturing? Is it something to kind of try and give the US leverage going into potentially finalising NAFTA negotiations and also just ahead of another round of talks in Beijing?
Well, I'm afraid that the negotiations, in a sense, are now over because the tariffs are now taking effect. You know, when the president announced this global tariff back in March, there was a great deal of concern, but it was mitigated by the fact that about half of imports were going to be exempt, those coming from our closest allies. That exemption is now terminated, and the tariffs will come into force with full effect. Why? Because Canada, Mexico, they refused to make the concessions that the U.S. was seeking in the NAFTA negotiations. Similarly for Europe, the U.S. had a list of demands. It wanted lower tariffs on autos. It wanted more purchases of LNG and U.S. beef. None of these parties were interested in negotiating with a gun to their head. They didn't come to an agreement, and that's why we face tariffs now on a global basis.
The reaction we've had from, let's face it, some of the United States' most close allies has been pretty swift, both in terms of the tit-for-tat response, tariffs on US goods, but also, really criticising the rationale of using national security as being the worst-case scenario, I think the Mexican economy minister said, and that President Trump is shooting himself in the foot. Is this dangerous territory now where you see really retaliatory action coming from these close allies?
Well, I think the allies are justified in doing exactly the right thing by imposing reciprocal restrictions on U.S. exports. Clearly, accommodation will get you nowhere with this administration. I think they have to show that they're ready to endure and inflict some political pain, hoping that that leads to a correction in U.S. policy. So I think they're doing the right thing here.
What about the very credibility or role of the international trade system? We've seen multiple attacks by the United States on institutions like the World Trade Organization. I mean, I suppose we see this kind of whiplash reaction, right? One day the trade war is on, the next day we're having very, good talks with the Chinese or with the European Union. How does this end, in your view?
That's exactly right. It's very hard to know because, frankly, there's no discernible long-term strategy by the administration. You mentioned before that the purpose, the reason that these tariffs were invoked was on the basis of national security. That is an incredibly slippery slope here because there is no discernible national security justification. And once you say that you're going to invoke that as an exception to the rules, that really opens the door not only for the United States to do this, but for countries around the world. And if that exception grows so large, then essentially the rules that facilitate commerce on a global basis have no meaning. And that is really the dangerous end result from all of this.